Marcus Chen had been walking for 3 days through the alien wilderness when he first saw the valley. His weathered hands gripped the makeshift walking stick he'd carved from local wood, and his faded camping gear bore the scars of a journey that had lasted far longer than anyone expected. At 61, he wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be alive, and certainly wasn't supposed to be the last free human in this sector of the galaxy. The valley stretched before him like something from an old Earth-nature documentary. Purple grass swayed in the gentle breeze, and crystalline trees caught the light of the twin suns overhead. Strange birds with iridescent feathers called to each other across the expanse, their songs almost melodic enough to be music. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache with homesickness for a world he'd never see again. But Marcus knew better than to trust beauty in this alien landscape. Every world the Dominion had conquered looked peaceful from a distance. That was part of their method. Preserve the natural splendor while systematically eliminating any species that might pose a threat to their expansion. Humans had been classified as a level 7 threat. There were no higher classifications. He'd been hiking through the wilderness for weeks now, ever since his escape from the processing facility on Kepler 442b. The note in his pocket, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling, had been his only guide. His father had written it in 1962 during the height of the Cold War, never knowing that his words about survival and persistence would one day guide his son through an interstellar conflict. "When the world goes mad," the note read in his father's careful handwriting, "find a place they don't expect you to be. Make them work for every inch. A determined man can outlast an army if he chooses his ground wisely." The old man had been talking about nuclear war, not alien conquest, but the principle remained the same. Marcus had chosen his ground, and this valley looked like exactly the kind of place the Dominion would overlook. Too small for a major base, too remote for regular patrols, and according to his stolen navigation device, completely unmarked on their territorial maps. As he made his way down the gentle slope, Marcus noticed something odd about the valley floor. The grass grew in strange patterns, creating what almost looked like geometric designs when viewed from above. Circles within circles, spirals that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, lines that converged on a central point near a cluster of the crystalline trees. His military training, rusty but still sharp after all these years, told him to be cautious. Patterns in nature usually meant intelligence, and intelligence meant either allies or enemies. In his experience, the universe had been running short on allies lately. The central point of the patterns turned out to be a small clearing surrounded by 7 of the crystal trees. Each tree was roughly the same height and thickness, and they formed a perfect circle around an area just large enough for a small campsite. The ground here was different too, softer, more like earth soil than the strange purple dirt he'd been walking on for days. Marcus set down his pack and examined the clearing more carefully. The trees weren't quite trees, he realized. They were some kind of mineral formation, crystalline structures that had grown from the ground in perfect geometric shapes. When he touched one, it hummed softly, a sound that seemed to resonate in his bones. That's when he saw the marker. It was small, easy to miss, unless you were looking for it. A piece of metal about the size of his palm, embedded in the largest of the crystal formations. The symbols on it were definitely alien, but they were arranged in a way that reminded him of warning signs back on Earth. The universal design language of "keep out" and "danger" was apparently more universal than anyone had imagined. Marcus studied the marker for a long time. His portable translator had been damaged in the escape, leaving him to guess at meanings based on context and intuition. But something about the symbols made his skin crawl. This wasn't just a warning. It was a prohibition, a rule carved in stone by beings who expected absolute obedience. The smart thing would be to keep walking, find another valley, Another hiding place, somewhere that didn't come with mysterious warnings in dead languages. But Marcus was tired, desperately tired, and this place felt safe in a way he hadn't experienced since the invasion began. The crystal trees seemed to hum with protective energy, and the geometric patterns in the grass created a sense of order that soothed his battle-worn nerves. More importantly, he was running out of options. His food supplies were nearly exhausted, his water purification tablets were down to the last few, and his aging body was starting to protest the constant movement. If he was going to make a stand anywhere, it might as well be in a place that felt like it had been waiting for him. Marcus made his decision with the pragmatism of a man who had survived 6 decades of an unpredictable universe. He would camp here, marker or no marker. Whatever rule he was breaking, the consequences couldn't be worse than slow starvation in the wilderness or capture by Dominion forces. He set up his small tent in the exact center of the clearing, directly beneath the spot where the crystal tree's humming seemed strongest. The sound was oddly comforting, like distant music or the purr of a contented cat. As he worked, he noticed that the geometric patterns in the grass seemed to pulse gently, as if responding to his presence. That first night, Marcus slept better than he had in months. The crystal trees seemed to create a barrier around his dreams, keeping out the nightmares that usually plagued his rest. When he woke in the morning, he found that the dew had formed strange patterns on his tent, spirals and circles that matched the designs in the grass. The second day brought visitors. Marcus was boiling water for his morning coffee when the humming of the trees changed pitch. It became urgent, almost musical, and the patterns in the grass began to glow faintly. He grabbed his rifle, an old earth weapon he'd managed to keep hidden during processing, and took cover behind the largest tree. They came from the sky, as they always did. 3 Dominion scout craft, sleek and silent, descending toward the valley like metallic vultures. Marcus watched through his scope as they circled the area, their sensors no doubt picking up his heat signature and the electromagnetic signature of his equipment. But something strange happened as they approached the crystal trees. The lead scout craft shuddered, then veered away as if struck by an invisible force. The other 2 followed suit, their perfect formation breaking apart as they retreated to a safer distance. Marcus lowered his rifle and watched in amazement as the alien craft circled the valley like sharks around a reef they couldn't quite approach. They made several attempts to descend, but each time something drove them back. The crystal tree's humming had become a symphony now. Complex harmonies that seemed to create a dome of sound over the clearing. After an hour of frustrated circling, the scouts departed. But Marcus knew the Dominion returned at dawn with overwhelming force. Marcus woke to the sound of atmospheric engines and the distinctive whine of charging energy weapons. Through the fabric of his tent, he could see shadows moving across the valley as dozens of craft took positions around the perimeter. Commander HFY of the 3rd Conquest Fleet stood aboard the primary assault vessel, studying the readings from their instruments with growing frustration. The human life sign was clearly visible in the center of the Forbidden Zone, but every attempt to lock weapons or deploy capture teams resulted in system failures and navigation errors. "Status report," HFY commanded, his 4 arms working independently to manipulate different control interfaces. "The anomaly persists, Commander," reported his tactical officer. "All ships experience severe electromagnetic interference when approaching the central clearing. Our weapon systems cannot maintain target lock, and transport beams are scattered by unknown energy fields." HFY's mandibles clicked in annoyance. In 3 centuries of conquest, the Dominion had never encountered a phenomenon that could so completely neutralize their technological advantages. The humans had been a difficult species to subdue, but their resistance had always been conventional. Ships, weapons, tactics that could be understood and countered. This was something else entirely. "What do we know about this location?" he asked. The tactical officer consulted his database. According to planetary surveys, this valley was marked as a minor archaeological site by the previous inhabitants. The Koresh civilization classified it as a place of deep harmony and established laws forbidding any settlement or disturbance of the area. The Koresh were primitive mystics, HFY dismissed. Their superstitions should not interfere with Dominion operations. But even as he spoke, the commander remembered why the Koresh had been among the most difficult conquests in Dominion history. They had possessed technologies that seemed to blur the line between science and what other species might call magic. Most of their secrets had died with them, but perhaps not all. Down in the clearing, Marcus was conducting experiments of his own. He'd spent the night moving around the crystal trees, testing their responses to his presence. What he'd discovered was extraordinary. The trees were not just randomly positioned. They formed a complex geometric pattern that seemed to channel and amplify certain types of energy. When Marcus stood in specific spots, the humming changed pitch and intensity. When he traced the patterns in the grass with his feet, the glow intensified. And when he placed his hands on multiple trees simultaneously, the entire clearing erupted in harmonious sound that made his bones vibrate and his vision blur with colors that had no names. More importantly, he was beginning to understand the warning marker. Using his basic knowledge of archaeological principles and a lot of guesswork, he'd worked out that the symbols weren't just a prohibition, they were instructions. A manual for operating something that the original inhabitants had considered too dangerous for casual use. The key was the human element. The trees responded to consciousness, to intention, to what his father might have called guts and determination. The previous inhabitants had been a peaceful species, Marcus realized. They'd created this place as a sanctuary, then forbidden its use because they understood its potential for destruction. But humans were different. Humans had spent millennia learning to harness dangerous forces for survival. As the Dominion ships maneuvered overhead, Marcus pressed his palms against two of the crystal trees and focused his mind on a single thought: protection. The humming intensified, and he felt power flow through the ground beneath his feet, up through the trees, and into the air above the clearing. The lead Dominion ship, attempting another approach, suddenly found itself flying backward despite its engines running at full forward thrust. The pilot struggled with the controls as his craft was gently but irresistibly pushed away from the valley. "Impossible," HFY muttered, watching his most advanced warship defeated by invisible forces. "Deploy the siege platforms. If we cannot enter the zone, we will destroy it from a distance." The siege platforms were massive constructs, each one capable of reducing a small moon to rubble. They took position at the edge of the atmosphere and began charging their primary weapons. The energy buildup was visible from the ground as points of brilliant light, gathering power high above. Marcus felt the change in the crystal trees immediately. Their humming became urgent, almost frantic. And the patterns in the grass began to pulse rapidly. Whatever force protected the clearing, it was preparing for something massive. He thought about his father's note again, tucked safely in his pocket. The old man had written about outlasting armies, about choosing your ground and making them work for every inch. But he'd also written something else. Something Marcus had always dismissed as philosophical rambling. "The strongest wall isn't made of stone or steel," the note continued in his father's careful script. "It's made of will. A man who absolutely refuses to surrender can hold a position that should fall to any reasonable force. The enemy's biggest weakness is that they expect you to be reasonable." Marcus looked up at the gathering lights in the sky and made perhaps the most unreasonable decision of his life. Instead of trying to hide or defend, he was going to attack. He moved to the exact center of the clearing and placed both hands on the ground. The soil here was warm, almost alive, and through it he could feel the vast network of energy that connected all 7 crystal trees. But more than that, He could sense something deeper, roots of power that extended far beyond this valley, connecting to other sacred sites across the planet. The Koresh hadn't just built one sanctuary. They'd built a network. Marcus closed his eyes and let his consciousness expand along those hidden channels. He could feel other clearings, other crystal formations, scattered across the planet like nerve cells in a vast brain. Most were dormant, their power sleeping beneath layers of Dominion construction and industrial development, but some were still active, still waiting for someone with the will to wake them. High above, the siege platforms completed their charging sequence. Beams of concentrated energy, each one capable of boring through solid rock for miles, lanced down toward the valley. They never reached the ground. The crystal trees erupted in brilliant light, and the energy beams simply vanished, absorbed and redirected by forces that Dominion science couldn't measure or understand. The light spread outward from the clearing in expanding rings, and wherever it touched, something amazing happened. Ancient Koresh sites across the planet began to wake up. Commander HFY watched in horror as his orbital displays lit up with energy signatures from hundreds of locations across the planet's surface. Cities where Dominion forces had established bases suddenly found themselves dealing with gravitational anomalies. Mining operations deep underground were flooded by water that seemed to appear from nowhere. And everywhere, the very ground seemed to be turning against the occupiers. "Sir," his communications officer reported with obvious panic, "we're receiving distress calls from every installation on the planet. They're requesting immediate evacuation." But evacuation might not be possible. The energy network that Marcus had awakened was growing stronger by the minute, and its effects were beginning to reach into space. Dominion ships found their engines failing, their weapons powering down, their navigation systems displaying impossible readings. In the clearing, Marcus stood at the center of a storm of light and sound that should have torn him apart. But instead of destruction, he felt connection. To the planet, to the ancient network, to something vast and protective that the Koresh had built into the very structure of their world. He understood now why they had forbidden the use of these sites. Not because they were dangerous, but because they required someone willing to become part of them. Someone willing to sacrifice their individual existence to become something larger. But Marcus had been alone for so long that the prospect of connection, even connection that might cost him his humanity, seemed like a gift rather than a sacrifice. The light reached its crescendo, and across the planet, every dom, 3 months after the awakening, Marcus stood on the ridge overlooking what had once been the Dominion's primary command center. The massive complex of metal and glass that had dominated the horizon was gone, reclaimed by vegetation that grew with impossible speed and purpose. Crystal formations sprouted from the earth like flowers after rain, each one humming with the same protective energy he'd first encountered in the valley. The planet was healing itself, and humanity was learning to help. "Marcus, you need to see this," called Sarah Martinez as she climbed up the ridge toward him. Sarah had been a xenoarchaeologist before the invasion, one of the few humans who'd studied the Koresh civilization before the Dominion classified such research as sedition. She'd found her way to a crystal site in the northern continent 2 weeks after Marcus's awakening, and like him, she'd discovered that human consciousness could interface with Koresh technology in ways its creators had never intended. "What is it?" Marcus asked, though he was already sensing the disturbance through his connection to the planetary network. Something was different today, a change in the harmonic patterns that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Sarah held up a crystalline tablet that pulsed with soft blue light. "I've been working on translating the deep archives, the ones buried beneath the major sites. Marcus, the Koresh didn't just build a defensive network. They built an offensive one, too." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. In the months since the awakening, they'd discovered dozens of human survivors scattered across the planet, each one learning to work with the ancient sites in their own way. Some, like Dr. Kim in the Eastern Territories, had become healers, using the crystal energy to repair both human and alien physiology. Others, like the group led by former Marine Captain Rodriguez, had learned to manipulate matter at the molecular level, creating shelter and supplies from raw earth and air. But all of their discoveries had been defensive in nature. Protection, healing, creation. The Koresh, from everything they'd learned, had been a peaceful species who'd used their technology to nurture and preserve rather than destroy. "Show me," Marcus said. Sarah activated the tablet, and symbols flowed across its surface like liquid light. The Koresh faced their own version of the Dominion about 50,000 years ago, a species called the Veltar, machine intelligences that consumed planets for raw materials. The Koresh tried diplomacy, tried coexistence, tried everything peaceful they could think of. The symbols on the tablet shifted, showing star maps with spreading zones of red that Marcus recognized as the universal symbol for conquest and destruction. When nothing else worked, Sarah continued, they activated something they called the Void Garden. It's not just planetary defense, Marcus. It's a weapon system that spans multiple star systems. Marcus studied the tablet, his enhanced connection to the crystal network allowing him to understand the symbols in ways that should have been impossible. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. The Void Garden was a network of crystalline constructs scattered across hundreds of worlds, each one capable of manipulating space-time itself. When fully activated, it could isolate entire star systems, creating bubbles of altered reality where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. The Veltar had found themselves trapped in regions of space where their technology simply stopped working, where their machine consciousness couldn't process the altered mathematics of existence. The Koresh won, Marcus realized. They didn't just defeat the Veltar, they erased them from reality. Sarah nodded grimly. And now the Dominion is triggering the same response. The crystal sites aren't just waking up on this planet, Marcus. Our long-range sensors are detecting similar activations on worlds the Dominion conquered decades ago. The network is coming online across the entire galaxy. Before Marcus could respond, the crystal formations around them erupted in brilliant light. But this wasn't the gentle, protective glow they'd grown accustomed to. This was something urgent, demanding, alive with purpose, that felt almost alien, despite their connection to it. Through his link to the network, Marcus felt the approach of something massive. The Dominion wasn't retreating. They were bringing everything they had. "Evacuation ships," Sarah said, checking her portable scanner. "Thousands of them. They're pulling their forces from every conquered world and massing them here." Marcus closed his eyes and extended his consciousness through the planetary network. What he found was sobering. The Dominion had indeed committed everything to this battle. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon in their vast arsenal was converging on this single world. They understood now that this wasn't just about one planet or one species. This was about the survival of their empire. High above the atmosphere, Supramarsh Kethvan, absolute ruler of the Dominion, stood aboard his flagship and contemplated the greatest crisis in his empire's history. The reports were flooding in from across the galaxy. Conquered worlds were expelling Dominion forces through phenomena that defied scientific explanation. Ancient sites that had been dismissed as archaeological curiosities were revealing themselves as components of a weapon system beyond imagination. "How many ships do we have in the fleet?" he asked his tactical coordinator. "Every vessel capable of faster-than-light travel, Supremarch, 12 million combat craft, supported by 3 billion smaller vessels. We have committed our entire mobile force to this engagement." Keth Vaughn's multiple eyes studied the tactical display. It was an armada capable of reducing a dozen solar systems to cosmic dust, yet he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 centuries of conquest: uncertainty. And the humans? Intelligence suggests fewer than 10,000 survivors on the planet's surface. However, the coordinator hesitated. However, our analysis indicates that individual humans may be capable of channeling energies equivalent to our largest weapons platforms. The force multiplication effect is unprecedented. Keth Van had studied the battle recordings from the first encounter with the awakened sites. A single human, exhausted and alone, had activated defenses that repelled an entire fleet. If 10,000 humans could achieve similar amplification, "Begin the assault," he commanded. "Full bombardment, all weapons. We end this now, regardless of cost." On the planet's surface, Marcus felt the moment when the Dominion fleet opened fire. 12 million ships discharged their weapons simultaneously, unleashing enough energy to shatter continents and boil oceans. None of it reached the ground. The crystal network had grown beyond anything the Koresh had originally envisioned. Powered by human will and guided by human stubbornness, it had become something new. The energy beams from the Dominion fleet struck an invisible barrier and simply ceased to exist, their power absorbed and redistributed through crystal formations across the galaxy. But Marcus could feel the strain on the network. The Dominion's assault was massive beyond comprehension, and even the ancient system had limits. "We need to activate the Void Garden," Sarah said, her voice tight with strain as she too felt the pressure on the crystal matrix. "That will trap them here," Marcus pointed out. "All of them. 12 million ships and everyone aboard them. They made their choice when they committed their entire fleet to this attack. If we don't stop them here, they'll eventually overwhelm the network, and then they'll have learned how to counter it." Marcus thought of his father's note, still in his pocket after all these months. The old man had written about determination, about refusing to surrender, about outlasting armies through sheer stubborn will. But he'd also written something else, something Marcus had discovered on the back of the note only recently. "Sometimes," his father had scrawled in faded ink, "the only way to save everything is to sacrifice everything. A man's worth isn't measured by what he lives for, but by what he's willing to die for." Marcus made his decision with the same pragmatic certainty that had carried him through 61 years of an unpredictable universe. He walked to the largest crystal formation on the ridge and placed both hands against its surface. "Activate the Void Garden," he said, his voice carrying across the network to every human connected to every crystal site across the planet. The response was immediate. From thousands of locations around the world, human survivors placed their hands on crystal formations and spoke the same words. The network pulsed with shared purpose, shared sacrifice, shared determination to end this threat once and for all. Reality twisted. The Dominion fleet found themselves trapped in a bubble of altered space-time where their weapons stopped working, their engines failed to respond, and their communications went dead. But unlike the ancient Veltar, they weren't simply erased. The humans had modified the Void Garden's function, creating a prison rather than an execution chamber. 12 million ships hung motionless in space, their crews alive but powerless, surrounded by an envelope of crystalline energy that would contain them until the end of time itself. On the planet's surface, Marcus felt the completion of the network's activation like a deep musical note that resonated in his bones. The Dominion was neutralized, their threat ended, their empire effectively decapitated. Across the galaxy, liberated worlds would have the time they needed to rebuild and prepare for whatever came next. But the cost had been enormous. The crystal network was burning itself out, its ancient mechanisms pushed beyond their design limits by the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. The formations around Marcus were already beginning to crack, their harmonic songs fading to whispers. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, her own connection to the network telling her what he already knew. "Hours," Marcus replied. "Maybe less. The network is dying." He looked around at the crystal formations that had become his home, his purpose, his connection to something greater than himself. In breaking the Koresh's ancient rule, in camping where no one was supposed to be, he'd discovered not just sanctuary, but a weapon capable of reshaping the balance of power in the galaxy. Now that weapon was burning itself out in one final act of defiance against tyranny. Marcus pulled out his father's note and read it one last time. The paper was almost transparent now, worn thin by handling, but the words were still clear. As the crystal formations around him sang their final song, he smiled and folded the note carefully before placing it in his pocket. He'd kept his father's advice, he'd chosen his ground, made them work for every inch, and outlasted an army through sheer determination. The cost had been everything, but the victory was absolute. In the distance, other humans were gathering, drawn by the same instinct that had brought him to this valley months ago. They would rebuild, would find new ways to defend their freedom, would carry the story of what happened here to other worlds and other species who needed to know that tyranny could be defeated. The crystal trees gave one final harmonic note and went silent. But Marcus Chen, 61 years old and the man who'd saved the galaxy by breaking a rule, was no longer alone. Humanity's fight for freedom had ended where it began, with one determined person refusing to surrender, regardless of the odds. The valley was quiet now, but it would be remembered forever. Inyan installation found itself cut off from their technology. Soldiers trained to fight with energy weapons found themselves holding useless metal. Pilots discovered that their ships would no longer respond to their commands. And everywhere, the message was the same. This world belonged to something older and more powerful than the Dominion had imagined. As the light finally began to fade, Marcus opened his eyes to find himself still human. Still himself, but changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. The crystal trees had gone quiet, but he could feel their power humming just beneath the surface, ready to respond to his will. Above, the Dominion fleet was in chaos. Ships drifted helplessly as their crews tried to restore power to systems that had simply decided to stop working. And in the distance, Marcus could see something that made his heart leap with impossible hope. Other lights were beginning to appear across the planet, lights that meant other humans, other survivors, other people who had found Koresh sites and learned to wake them. His gesture of defiance had become a signal, and that signal was being answered. The old soldier smiled as he sat down next to one of the crystal trees and took out his father's note. He was no longer the last free human in this sector. He was the first of something new. He'd be back, probably with reinforcements and better equipment. The Dominion didn't give up easily, especially when they encountered something they didn't understand. That evening, as he sat by his small fire and ate a meager dinner of processed protein bars, Marcus took out his father's note and read it again. The paper was getting fragile, but the words were still clear. "A determined man can outlast an army if he chooses his ground wisely." Maybe the old man had been right about more than he knew. Marcus looked around at the crystal trees, still humming their protective song, and at the patterns in the grass that seemed to pulse with ancient power. He'd broken their rule by camping here, but perhaps that rule existed for a reason. Perhaps this place had been waiting for someone desperate enough, determined enough, to make use of whatever protection it offered. As the twin suns set and alien stars emerged in the unfamiliar sky, Marcus made another decision. He wouldn't just hide here. He would learn. Learn about the trees, about the patterns, about whatever force was keeping the Dominion at bay. If he was going to be the last free human in this sector, he might as well figure out how to use every advantage he could find. The crystal trees hummed their approval, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus thought he heard the sound of approaching ships. The Dominion was coming back, just as he'd expected. But for the first time since the invasion began, Marcus Chen smiled. He'd found his ground, and he intended to hold it.